We all have our demons.
Not enough pain.
What's up, everybody on YouTube? It's Kilrien. I'm back. Another video. Today, we're playing WoW a little bit. This is probably going to be another video of me running around Dalaran because the thoughts that I have on this topic require that I not say or I not try to talk about it while I'm playing, or otherwise I will ramble off into the sunset. Today, I'm actually talking about item values and item squish, and why I am generally a proponent of the fact that it is happening in Battle for Azeroth. Now, to set the stage a little bit, I like big numbers, and I cannot lie. You other statisticians cannot deny that when a health bar walks in with 8 digits to its name and 100% in your face, I don't have a way to finish that. That's where I'm ending that Baby Got Back reference. Right, so health bars, health totals, damage in general in Legion, it's fucking ridiculous. It wasn't all that long ago, about 3 years now, that we got everything squished down. And yet here we are 3 years later, and we have to do it again. Now, I've talked in the past a little bit with dungeon soloing and some other points specifically about what happened, and I've talked about what I think is good about what's being done about it, but I think it's worth taking a bit of a different approach to it, right? So, it is worth looking at the fact that our item level goes up more than it has in the past. That's important context, if nothing else, because it's worth understanding why it's become such a problem in recent years compared to the past of the game. If I go into the dungeon journal, we just look at raids, right? Let's start with Classic. If we go all the way back, Molten Core, right? Great dungeon. Okay, it was boring and shit, and it was just a thing that you did. My guild, we had a warlock on Vent that talked about getting high and playing and how much he loved it. And he was also one of our better players, so, you know, that works out. But, I mean, look at the item levels of most of this stuff. 70, 66. So, like, first of all, back in the day, like, Blizzard didn't really have a strong itemization philosophy or a reward philosophy in World of Warcraft. It's pretty obvious that it took them a while to figure out what it was about content and about the rewards that players received that made them want to come back. But if you look on average, items scale from anywhere from around like 64 item level at the low end to like 74 if they're dropping off of Ragnaros and trinkets. But it's all over the place, but it's kind of interesting to have sort of a tier differentiation within a raid tier. And then you go over to Blackwing Lair, and early on you actually have a fair amount of overlap. Item level 73 two-handed sword is pretty close item level, or actually in a couple of cases a little bit lower than rewards that drop off of Ragnaros, who is kind of technically considered a part of tier 2, just given what he drops as far as the armor. But then you have like item level 77 from Chromagus at the tail end of the raid. 81 from Nefarian, sure, but like you can still see that Blizzard's kind of trying to find itself here. But the point of looking at this is that the difference between the tiers, if we then go to AQ40, the largest end tier raid that's currently, well, really what's currently acknowledged as the end of vanilla rating in Dungeon Journal, at least in game. That was a terrible sentence, don't mind me. You've got 75, 76, 73, 77, 78. Like, a lot of the gear was kind of intended to be a bridge into Naxxramas, so you have stuff off of Cthulhu that drops around 88. This is where you start seeing things get kind of consistent. Oro, likewise, drops in 81, 81. So you're getting a little bit closer to a sort of standardized itemization, but it took basically until Wrath of the Lich King for them to like fully iron out the item level like problem and figure out that item level is how players wanted to be rewarded. It was easiest, you could notice too, to make that shift really, really apparent. Now, the problem is that over time, what an apparent item level shift is, it has changed. At the very... Oh, hey, look, a multi-boxer. Anyways, so... Back during Wrath of the Lich King, when we had heroic difficulty added to raids, eventually, what we often had was a half-tier difference between the normal and the heroic version, usually. So early on, it was pretty common to say, okay, well, the stuff that drops from the tail end of Nax is 226. So, like Sartharian hard mode gear, 226. Malagos's gear, 226. Later on, that changed a little bit, and it kind of became more the full tier jumps that we saw. So you would have this weird thing. And in Wrath, it was weird because of 10-player and 25-player modes. So you would have this thing where it was like, okay, well, 10-player has to drop gear that's better than 25-player last tier, but not by much. So like Ulduar 10-player gear was item level 219 because 213 was the 25-player like floor for the previous tier. So it would go up a little bit, and then you would scale up from that. So like heroic 10-player would drop 226. 226 then became the floor for 25-player, and then 25 heroic would be half a tier up from that, usually around 232. With a couple of choice items dropping at 239. It was pretty much weapons and anything from Algalon in Ulduar. So the reason for the history lesson, and I'm not going to keep going past that point, is that Blizzard kind of figured out that scaling up item level in sort of an exponential fashion was the easiest way to get people to pay attention to higher difficulties and to continue to push for a higher reward. Warlords of Draenor was the last time this was really changed, because we now settled on nice round item levels. So instead of 6 and 13 and all that weird shit they used to do, it's like 15 item levels is the gap. So like right now, normal Antorus is 930, and that's sort of the floor. You go 15 down from that to get your LFR level. So okay, so LFR then is 915. And then you go 15 up from that to get heroic, which is 945. And then you add 15 more on top of that for mythic to get 960. And then you might have bosses that vary a little bit within that. In the first tier, you had Gul'dan dropping slightly higher gear. And then, the first tier is always a mess, because then there's always stuff like Trial of Valor or little mini raids, or what you might do with the last boss or whatever. Nighthold had variation with Gul'dan dropping higher item level stuff. Tomb of Sargeras had Kil'jaeden drop higher item level stuff. And now Argus, the Unmaker, drops higher item level stuff in Antorus. So the problem becomes pretty apparent when you look at it that way. Scaling item levels by such big jumps of 15 item levels per difficulty across 4 difficulties, and then having to jump the base item level enough to like get over the hump of the previous tier, kind of sucks for Blizzard, right? It kind of sucks for players too, right? Because like early on it's cool. Like it's great that when you first zone into a new raid, you have all this new shit you can get, and it's great to equip new stuff and feel powerful and to get big upgrades. Like in the 2 weeks Antorus has been out, I went from a 932 item level to a 944, and thanks to Titan Forging, which is not in scope for what I'm going to talk about today, I already have a mythic level ring. Thanks, Cash. So it's an interesting system, but my question and what I'm kind of posing here, and I don't really have a solution to this, I want to head that off up front. If you're coming to this video expecting me to like be able to solve that problem, no. I don't know. I legitimately don't know enough about what excites people to play to be able to propose an alternative. But what I do know is this. We are going to have to squish items every couple of years at this pace, because no matter what the solution ultimately ends up being, we always then rapidly inflate upwards. So Battle for Azeroth is approaching this a little bit differently, and I think it's worth evaluating why. So the first item, Squish, was quite literally a curve squish as well. What they did is they took all the exponential jumps in item level and they kept them intact. So everything kept exactly the same item level. What they did is they used a weird curve to make it so that stuff at the bottom end of the item level scale had actual less value per item level. If you look at, for example, some of this gear from AQ40, if we look at an actual piece of gear, like, okay, these shoulders, they're item level 77, right? They have 20 agi, 20 stam. So if we go to Burning Crusade, let's say to Black Temple, where they're going to be about 140, so about double the item level, right? If I go look at shoulders from AQ40 at from Black Temple at 141, they have less stamina by 4, not a lot, but they have secondary stats to make up for it. And then they have more agility by 3. So you can kind of see the problem here. The item level doubles, the stats barely go up at all. Now that was the design intent of the initial item squish implemented in version 6.0 of WoW. It wasn't to like flatten the curve or anything. It was just to make it so that the value of an item level increases very slowly right up until Mists of Pandaria content, and then it starts to jump up again. And then in Warlords content, it continues to jump up to the actual value where it stabilizes. Now that is a bit of a problem, because what it contributes to is what we currently see at the low end of leveling. Arguably a big part of the problem with leveling, in terms of being able to one-shot mobs and all of that, comes from the fact that item level right now is absolutely fucked. If I want to gain power going from, you know, late classic, let's say level 60, to Burning Crusade, gear actually doesn't provide that. Not on the scale you would expect or need. You get a little bit of power, you get a little bit of stuff, but not a whole lot, and that's a problem. That's a big problem if you're Blizzard. So Battle for Azeroth's item squish is aiming to do something a little bit different. What they've done is they've re-equalized what an item level is worth, meaning that regardless of what point in the curve you pick up a piece of gear, one item level is worth the same amount of stats, meaning it scales up pretty quickly and scales up pretty reasonably. But in order to combat that, they've actually then done a different type of squish. Instead of squishing the value of item levels and kind of flattening everything down to a smaller curve to allow for inflation to happen during Battle for Azeroth, they just cut the item level on things instead. The peak item level of anything that we'll get during Legion, our item level 1000 legendaries, will turn into item level 335 pieces of gear. So there's a substantial squish of item level, a little over 600 item levels of squish. What we don't know is how this affects gear at the low end. I would assume, given that they're also revamping leveling, that this has been accounted for, but unfortunately we haven't been able to see that yet. And the ways it's been related to outlets that have asked has basically been to use current Legion levels. So we don't know what this is going to look like for old raid gear. We don't know what this will look like for leveling gear. But what we can see and what becomes rapidly apparent here is that the problem with item level squishing in any form or fashion is that what's causing our power as players to inflate so rapidly over time is not the actual value of the items themselves. It's not that our item level is just too high in a vacuum. Our item level is too high because Blizzard has deemed it the only mechanism that works as an incentive to get us to do content over and over. Admittedly, I'm in a guild that does normal clears of raids and then goes to heroic. And the primary reason for that is simple. We get better gear out of heroic. There's, some more cool stuff to the fights, and there's some cool cosmetic rewards, like the heroic only mounts off of last bosses of expansions, like the Moose, or the Grove Warden from Hellfire Citadel, and the Violet Spellwing that comes off of Argus in heroic this time. But arguably the greatest value comes from upgrading your gear. At the heart of any RPG is a progression system, and once you've hit a level cap and you can no longer gain experience and levels in that way, it becomes essential to do it through other means, through gear in this case, and that's been WoW's model for the entirety of its life. Unfortunately, what we're seeing happen is that the gear reward scales far, far too much. What we'll probably end up seeing in Battle for Azeroth is something very similar, where I don't know what our gear is going to look like at the start of the end game of Battle for Azeroth. What I can tell you from my first-hand experience at BlizzCon was that the demo characters that were 110 and were effectively like your fresh 110 that just went into leveling content right after, like somebody who rolled during Battle for Azeroth and hit 110, that gear was item level 185. Which puts it below most of the raid gear from Legion, which is the right design for leveling content. The leveling content should be designed for players who aren't farming endgame gear. You shouldn't have to stop at each endgame tier and then spend a few, months or weeks or days or whatever, probably days in WoW to be honest, farming, a full set of progression raid gear, because that's unreasonable to expect a new player to do, to continue enjoying the game. So what we don't know currently is where we scale to past that point. Item level scaling during leveling can be either really large and expansive or really small. Warlords of Draenor, both recent expansions actually give us great examples of differences in that approach. Warlords of Draenor scaled gear at the top end, very, very small levels of power. We ended Siege of Orgrimmar Mythic with, maybe 572 gear, and the best you would get from leveling was around 590. Barely 20 levels of improvement. When you did your normal dungeons, you were around 600, 610, with a couple pieces at 615. So even with that, your item level scaled like by 30 to 45 or less item levels of value from one level cap to another that are 10 character levels separated. On the other hand, if you look at Warlords of Draenor into Legion, you could have theoretically ended Warlords of Draenor with a full Titanforge set of Hellfire Citadel Mythic gear at 750, and the ring at 795 if you had your legendary ring, and the starting gear was around 800 at the tail end. So, but that assumes that you had full Titanforge 750 gear. For most players like myself, I ended on my monk at the very tail end of Hellfire Citadel. I was around 715. So 715, even to a base level green 110, scaled up to 780, which is about a difference of 65 item levels. So not terribly much more, but then when you factor in the difference from all of the gear that we've had since, the difference is pretty substantial. And Legion has had the most item bloat of any expansion in history, in part because there's constant expansion on all sides. Every time a new raid comes out, we have to have 4 tiers of difficulty, each one encompassing 15 item levels of power. So alone, if you just factor in that scale, you're staring at about 45 item levels in total, from the lowest at LFR to the top end at Mythic, which is a substantial jump every tier. Because then the difference between tiers isn't just 45 item levels, there's usually another 15 or 20 added on. Just for the sake of comparison, in LFR alone, Tomb of Sargeras gear was 885, and that jumps about 30 item levels to 915 to give us LFR and Taurus gear. So the upgrade is substantial. And that's happened every tier to some extent. The earlier tiers are necessarily more constrained, but once you start cutting loose a little bit, it gets crazier. Nighthold LFR was 860, so it only went up 25 to get to Tomb of Sargeras, but again, that's still a pretty large jump. So the problem I see with Blizzard here is that as long as item level remains the carrot on a stick, what gets us into raids, what gets us playing, what gets us looking to perform and to do the content that's provided us, then every few years this problem will continue to crop up. If we have 3 raid tiers over the course of Battle for Azeroth, we'll probably end the expansion right around item level 500 or so, just doing some quick inside my head math. So at item level 500 already again, after having effectively told characters to start around 185 if they're just jumping right into leveling, it's a pretty substantial overall jump. And even if you factor in the jump from Legion legendaries that have been scaled from 1000 to 335, that's still a jump of almost a little over 150 item levels. So it's still going to be pretty massive if their strategy for scaling rewards is the same. Now what we don't know is if that's still the case. We have yet to see any discussion from Blizzard about how values are going to continue to scale into Battle for Azeroth. We have no idea what the raid reward structure is going to look like. We assume that it's going to continue because it seems like Blizzard overall is pleased with those results and has mostly resigned themselves to the possibility that they're going to have to keep doing this every single time that numbers get out of hand. And arguably, we have a strong reason in lore to actually do such a reset. If you look at our characters right now, most of our power comes from artifact weapons. The easiest way to demonstrate this is just to take mine off. I have 9.1 million health right now. If I take this off, my health plummets to 4.9 million. Almost half of my health is bound up solely in my artifact weapon. That's insanity. But we'll be siphoning corruption off with those and getting rid of them pretty shortly. So in lore, it makes all the sense in the world that we're going to have an item squish. Now, I'm not saying every time Blizzard needs to have that lore reason, but what I would like to see happen for the future of the game is a design that allows us maybe not to have them so frequently. Ideally, I would not like to be making the same video in 2020 or 2021 talking about how in 12.0 Super Draenei Argus Expedition 2, where we retrieve Illidan and Sargeras from the Seat of the Pantheon, which has crashed into some other planet and caused a time loop. I don't know. I'm making shit up now. Anyways, when we get to that future point, we shouldn't have to see things scale back so frequently. And a part of what worries me about item squishes in general is that I do like readable numbers. I just don't like everything changing and being so difficult to evaluate expansion to expansion in terms of relative power. And with the reward structure in Legion, if this continues on into the future of the game, we're very likely going to see squishes happen even more frequently. Warlords of Draenor only had 2 raid tiers and didn't have, well, it had a similar scaling problem to that of Legion in terms of the rewards scaling up so quickly, but with only 2 raid tiers and without a Mythic Plus system or World Quest system beside it upgrading player power outside of those raids, there wasn't as much of a need to scale everyone. Legion has had 3 raid tiers, each with the same reward structure, alongside an evolving Mythic Plus system that has continually offered raid level gear for dungeon level play. So there's a reward scaling issue that will definitely come back to bite Blizzard if it continues on this path. If we're rewarding raid tier upgrades the same way perpetually, then we're just going to see the values of our character stats shoot up and up and up. They'll rapidly continue to inflate. Now, without artifacts and the percentage increases, this may not matter as much, but I do worry about that possibility. But I've rambled enough about that. So I'd just like to close by saying I'm very happy to see that numbers will be going back to readable totals. I'm not going to be have to parse damage into millions or hundreds of thousands to understand what's going on. It'll be much easier and more readable. I much prefer healers, AoE heals healing for 39 health than healing me for 390,000 and having that be some incomprehensible mess of number I have to read. So I am happy to see scaling going back in and seeing us squish down to more sane numbers. I just feel like Blizzard does need to do some work there to balance that out and shift away from having to do that so frequently, because with the current model they will have to do it more frequently, especially if content delivery continues at the pace it has for Legion. So that's it for the video. If you liked it, make sure to hit up that like button, give me a comment, give me a subscribe. I always appreciate those. I always read and answer everyone's comments the best I can, so definitely check it out. Also, I'm streaming on Twitch 6 nights a week, Monday through Saturday. I have information on that in the info box below, along with a link to my Twitch channel, which is twitch.tv/KaleRien. I've also got a WordPress blog full of my thoughts about MMOs, gaming, and WoW specifically at kalerien.wordpress.com. And lastly, short form thoughts about gaming and some pithy comments over at KaleRien on Twitter. So thank you so much for watching, and until the next video, I'll see you next time, and take care.
Thank you.